Chris Hassel. Not quite football season yet, but we're getting there. Today, the official beginning of Conference Media Days season, with the Big 12 kicking us off in the midst of major changes and a bunch of questions for this conference in particular. We know that Texas and Oklahoma are leaving. We know that Cincy and UCF and Houston and BYU are joining, and they'll be there next year. What is the Big 12 going to be down the road, though? Will they be a potential super conference that poaches teams from the Pac-12, or a conference in danger of losing more teams, maybe more of its name brands as well? Brett Yormark has to hit the ground running as commissioner.
As I said in my opening comments, we're exploring all options, and we're open for business. And optionality is good, and we're vetting through all of them. I think it's fair to say I've received a lot of phone calls, a lot of interest. People understand the direction of the Big 12, and we're exploring those levels of interest. Nothing is imminent, but we're working hard to make sure that we position the Big 12 in the best possible way on a go-forward basis.
Big 12 going to be changing a lot over the next several years. Texas and Oklahoma are going to leave the conference, but they're going to be there for the next several years, maybe even until 2025. Next year, the conference will add BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. So for next season, there might be 14 teams in this conference before it then goes back to 12, unless it decides to add some more teams. Brady Quinn is down at Big 12 Media Days in Arlington, Texas. Brady, what's the buzz down there about potential expansion? And do you think this is a conference that needs to look that way to stay as relevant as possible?
I think they do. And I don't necessarily know that the strategy is strength in numbers, but one of the things you heard their commissioner, Brett Yormark, say multiple times today was a national brand. He continued to keep saying that. And I think what he means by that is expanding their geographic footprint by potentially bringing in some teams that look like they're in need of safe harbor, whether it's Oregon, Washington, or other big brands within the college sports realm. So it would make some sense, especially once Oregon and Texas decide to move on to the SEC, whether that's in 2025, or if some people tend to think that they might be able to get out early in 2024. Either way, we're going to have a 14-team Big 12 conference that will most likely have to have two divisions because of the size of the conference, starting next year with the addition of the four aforementioned teams that you spoke of, as well as Oklahoma and Texas still hang around if they don't want to pay that 9-figure exit fee that it would cost them to get out of the Big 12 early.
Which conference is in better shape right now, the Big 12 or the Pac-12? It seems that they're kind of at a stalemate right now, and we don't know which one is going to potentially add or potentially fold.
I think it's the Big 12, and for this reason. I think there's a thought that in order to get into the earlier time windows to generate greater TV revenue, you got to be able to play some games in the Central Time Zone, Eastern Time Zone, and as of right now, the Big 12 is going to offer that starting next year, and at least in the Central Time Zone starting this year. You just don't have that luxury right now in the Pac-12 unless you find a bunch of non-conference games over on the East Coast. But again, once you get into regular conference play, those rights aren't going to be worth quite as much. So that's the driving force, I think, behind all of this realignment right now, is the money that's behind it from the TV networks. And unless you're a conference that can find ways of getting those earlier time windows, like the noon window, which was the most watched window in college football last season and has been a growing window for years, you're just not going to be able to be a part of as big of a piece of the pie when it comes to the TV rights deals.
Well, let's talk on the field going into this season. Last year, we had the Baylor Bears snap Oklahoma's long reign as champions. And the preseason media poll has the Baylor Bears getting the majority of first place votes and the most points. Baylor is the favorite, followed by Oklahoma. Then it's Oklahoma State, then Texas. And it's interesting, Texas picked fourth, but they right now are the betting favorite to win the conference at 2-1. Let's take a listen to what Bears head coach Dave Aranda had to say. A year after being picked eighth, now they're picked to win it.
It's not about necessarily perfection. It's like any form of I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, you have to move with imperfection, continue to move, continue to get better, right? I think that's the goal for us. And so to keep your eyes on that, and to focus on what's real. Because I think like this is way cool with the lights and all the people and you know, being asked questions can feel cool, man, you know. But I think like that's really not real. You know, what's real is the what's happening day to day in your locker room, in your weight room, you know, in your cafeteria, right? How the team is handling each other or how they handling situations and all of it, right? Are we becoming a player-led team? Or do we still need to be a coach-led team? And so I think to put the focus where the focus needs to be, I guess, would be my answer to that.
Incredible job last season by Aranda and the Bears, and then, of course, won a New Year's Six bowl game as well. Brady, high expectations and probably higher than Aranda would like at this point. Are the Bears the team to beat in this conference again?
I don't necessarily see it that way, but I think one of the reasons why they were voted to be the favorite to win it this year has everything to do with their head coach, Dave Aranda, and what you heard him just talking about. He has a great feel as far as how to lead, meaning that you've got times when you've got veteran teams like what he had last year with a bunch of players and guys who could hold each other accountable and step up and make plays when they needed to. And then you've got times where it's got to be a coach-led team, like a time like this year, where Blake Shapen, their quarterback, who he decided to, Dave Aranda made the start of this past spring, only has a couple of starts where he's played well in those instances. In particular, the Big 12 championship game, played extremely well, but only 2-0 as a starter, so a lot yet to be determined. And they lose their leading pass from last year. Abram Smith, their leading rusher, their leading receiver in Tyquan Thornton, their leading tackler in Bernard, interceptions, tackles for loss. All those players are now gone. And so you've got to replace that on your roster, and they're going to have to grow up quick, I think, if they want to live up to the hype now that they've got moving into this season. But again, there's a lot of faith and trust in the culture that Dave Aranda has built there in Baylor, building back up that program.
Tough conference schedule as well, going to Texas, to Oklahoma, to Texas Tech, to Iowa State, and a quote-unquote non-conference game at BYU. That'll be a conference game next year. So Baylor picked first in the conference. Then it's Oklahoma, a team that has owned this conference for a long time. It's a new-look Oklahoma team. They lost Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams to USC. What do you expect from new head coach Brent Venables and his new quarterback, Dillon Gabriel?
Well, I'll start off with Brent Venables, where obviously he's been, he's been attractive to many schools for a while now, becoming their head coach. This was the opportunity, though. He chose to actually take that step after being a long-time assistant, being extremely successful, winning a couple of national championships during his time at Clemson and plenty of conference titles as well. But it was Oklahoma he chose to come back and save. And I think the thing I love about him is he brings a different energy, a different style from a defensive side of the football to a program that when they're playing their best, when they're dominating the Big 12, they're leading the Big 12 defensively. We always talk about their high-powered offense, but really defensively, too, is what flies under the radar. And it's one of the reasons why they've been able to continue to dominate as compared to Texas, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where they just haven't been able to figure out how to play defense anymore. But when you look at what Brent Venables brings to the table, a different feel, high energy, and extreme focus on taking care of the football, but also he brought in Jeff Levy. Jeff Levy, who's had a ton of success as an offensive play caller, now as the coordinator. And you mentioned Dillon Gabriel, their quarterback. There's been no quarterback over the past 3 seasons that's accounted for more total yards per game. Obviously, last season was cut short for Dillon Gabriel breaking his clavicle. But I've got high hopes and high aspirations for him coming back and paired back with Jeff Levy, who was his play caller his freshman year at UCF. So this is going to be a tandem that's going to be dangerous. They're going to put up a lot of points, a lot of yards. They did replenish some of what they lost in the transfer portal. All those guys who decided to go off with Lincoln Riley or elsewhere, they replenished some of that too. So they are reloaded, and to me, they should be the favorite to win this conference. Okay,
picked second, right ahead of Oklahoma State. I know you like them. We'll talk about them in a second. But Texas is picked fourth. They've got Quinn Ewers at quarterback. They've won 10 games just once since 2010, though, Brady. They're the favorites in Vegas to win. A lot of people are high on the horns. They've got the great recruiting class coming in. What are the realistic expectations for this season?
Well, obviously, you're always going to try to win your conference. I mean, that's always the goal to start out with. But they need to figure out a way to play better defense. It's not just about Quinn Ewers and how he'll handle the spotlight now of being the quarterback at the University of Texas. I mean, he's the highest touted recruit since Vince Young, who obviously brought them a national championship. But that hasn't been their Achilles heel. This school has been able to put up yards and points since Steve Sarkisian was there and even before he got there. It's the defense that I mentioned earlier. And what they did this offseason was add really the defensive guru for a long time in the Big 12, and Gary Patterson. Now, he's not calling the defense. That's still Pete Kwiatkowski. But he will put his footprint on this defense and help improve that side of the football. And so to me, that's one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of people who are betting favorites out there saying, we know they can score points. If they can just get a few stops, get a few turnovers, and find ways of shutting down some teams, they'll have a shot. But I think when you look at this schedule, and you talked about that recruiting class that may play a big impact, my concern is that early game versus Alabama, who I think should be the favorite to win the national championship this season. If they stumble and get beat bad in week 2, how does that team recover, especially a young and experienced team? You talk about Quinn Ewers, but really the rest of the crew that would be playing on offense and defense. How do they respond to a potential early loss and beating versus one of the best teams in the country? And then you have to reload and prepare yourself for that rivalry versus Oklahoma. So it's a tough start to the season, the way they have to play Alabama week 2, and then Oklahoma only a few weeks later with such a young team with such high aspirations. So we'll see how they handle adversity. We'll see how they come out of the gate.
Yeah, they might be a 3-touchdown underdog in that game against Alabama. Brady, we've got Baylor as the pick to win this thing. A year ago, they were picked 8th, and they won the Big 12 championship. How about a potential surprise, or maybe a couple surprise teams that you could see jumping up, biting some people, and maybe contending for a title this season?
Yeah, the one surprise team to me that's most interesting is Kansas State. I think when you look at Adrian Martinez, their quarterback, who was a transfer out of Nebraska, things never really worked out after you saw that early success that he had there. But he wants to join Chris Kleinman. Chris Kleinman brings back one of the all-time greats at quarterback for Kansas State, and Colin Klein to be the offensive play caller. And they've got the best, arguably the best running back next to Bijan Robinson in the conference, and Deuce Vaughn, who impacts the game in a variety of ways. Felix and Uduke Uzama, their edge rusher, might be the best edge rusher in the conference. So Kansas State, if you look at the schedule, the way it pans out, they're going to have the opportunity really to play spoiler for a lot of these teams. And I think when you look at who's dominated this conference over recent years, it's been Oklahoma. And they've had their number 2 out of the last 3 years. So between Malik Knowles and Phillip Brooks, some of those playmakers, if Adrian Martinez can add something to the passing game to match with what they already have in Deuce Vaughn, we know they're going to play solid, sound defense. Look out for Kansas State surprising a lot of people and maybe sneaking up and being like Baylor was just a year ago.
All right, Brady Quinn joining us from Arlington, site of the Big 12 Media Days this week. They're the first big conference to meet the media. We've got the SEC coming up next week. But looking at the odds to win the Big 12 this season, it does not jive with the preseason media poll. Texas was picked 4th. They're the favorites. Baylor was picked to win it. They have the 4th best odds. Oklahoma always seems like the smart money is on the Sooners, though they did not win it once again last season. Oklahoma State was in the Big 12 championship game a season ago. They are plus 400. Brady sleeper, Kansas State at 14-1.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.